dust lifted in slow veils when the buckboard halted at the edge of Red Hollow, and a meadowlark sang over the bone handle of a knife lodged in a stranger woman's side. Her bonnet hung by one string, her dress was prairie-grimed, yet she knelt in the ruts as if the earth itself had told her to remain. Reed Ashford stepped down, hat brim low, palms open to show peace, each footfall careful, the gait of a man who knows fear runs faster when chased. He crouched so the dust rose around his boots and spoke for her alone. "Ma'am?" Her cracked lips parted. "Let me die here," she breathed, as if the verdict had already been signed inside her bones. Reed shook his head once. "Not while I'm breathing." The well bucket clanged. Two boys at the hitch rail stopped laughing. Even the wind paused, listening to the line he had drawn. Marshal Harlan Pike eased from his office, badge bright, eyes narrow. "What's this?" "Knife's still in," Reed said without looking up. "We need a quiet room and boiled water." Reed shrugged off his coat and pressed it firm beside the blade to brace it, careful not to jar the wound. She stared through heat-shimmer eyes, surprise and pain wrestling in them like colts not yet broken. "Name?" he asked softly. "Mara," she whispered after a beat, as if she had tried other names in her head, and found this one could still carry her. "I'm Reed," he said. "I'm going to lift you. Don't touch the knife. Look at me." He gathered her as a man lifts a sleeping child, one arm beneath her knees, one firm at her shoulders, his coat held to the wound, his breath slow so she could borrow its pace. The townsfolk parted because a certainty had entered the road with him, the simple certainty of a promise that would not budge. On the mercantile porch, Tolliver Crane watched with generous hands folded on a generous belly, his smile polite, his eyes quick as prairie dogs. The light found the knife's bone handle and showed a neat, faint scratch along the guard, a flourish like a merchant's mark. Reed did not name the thought. He only noted how Crane's gaze did not leave that spot. Mara's head tipped toward his chest. "You shouldn't," she murmured. "It follows." "Then it can follow me," he said, and stepped into the clinic's lamplight and carbolic. Mrs. Kemp, who kept clean sheets and sterner opinions than the marshal, set a kettle on, laid out linen, and ordered the loiterers outside. Reed lowered Mara to the table, never letting the coat slip, never letting his eyes leave hers for long. "Stay," he said. The word meant as much for her spirit as for her body. Outside, hooves rang, someone riding off too fast for an easy noon, and Reed marked the sound without turning his head. Marshal Pike hovered in the doorway. "You sure you want this tangle, Ashford?" "I don't choose tangles," Reed answered. "I choose people." Mara shut her eyes against pain, and then forced them open again, as if she feared the world might vanish if she blinked. "Why here?" he asked, not prying so much as giving her a thread to hold. She let a thin breath go. "Because here there was a man who would say what you said." The weight of that settled under his ribs like a second heartbeat he had not known he carried. Mrs. Kemp handed him a strip of linen and a look that said if he fainted, she would step over him to finish the job. He smiled without showing teeth. "I won't." Through the open window drifted the creak of the mercantile sign, and, beneath it, a soft murmur that agreed too quickly for comfort. Reed pressed the brace a fraction firmer. "Listen, Mara. In a moment we'll draw the blade. You will want to chase the pain. Don't. Breathe with me." She nodded, the tremor more felt than seen. He leaned so close his hat brushed the wall, and spoke low enough that the room forgot anyone else. "There's nothing in this town I intend to keep more than you breathing." Her mouth tried for a smile and nearly found one. "Folks will talk," the marshal muttered, as if talk were weather. "They can use their mouths," Mrs. Kemp said crisply. "I need their hands." Water rattled in the kettle. The lamp hissed. Dust motes drifted like tiny parishioners in the gold air. Reed counted with her, 1, 2, 3, until the rhythm braided their breaths and steadied her eyes. Out on the street, Tolliver Crane's footsteps paused beneath the window, and then went on, soft as a man humming to himself. Reed did not look up. The vow he had spoken back on the road lay between them like a drawn line, and beyond Red Hollow the afternoon sounded like a prayer that might yet be answered. The room smelled of carbolic and iron, and Mara's blood darkened the linen beneath Reed's steady hand. Mrs. Kemp muttered about fools who carried burdens heavier than themselves, but her fingers were brisk, skilled, already grinding the poultice that might draw poison away. The marshal leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, boots crossed, eyes fixed not on Mara, but on Reed, as if waiting to measure how far a quiet man would go when he chose a side. Mara shifted, her breath catching sharp as glass. "Leave it!" she rasped. "Don't take it out. Let me go." Reed bent closer, his hat shadowing them both. "I already told you, Mara, not while I'm breathing." Her gaze fluttered toward the window where sunlight poured in golden slants, catching dust like scripture. She swallowed and shaped words carefully, as if each one cost her something precious. "Don't trust him?" Reed asked softly. "Who?" Her eyes flicked toward the mercantile across the street, then squeezed shut against a spasm of pain. Mrs. Kemp caught the glance and frowned, but she said nothing, only poured boiling water into a basin until steam fogged the window. Reed felt the message more than he heard it. The way her body stiffened told him she had just spent the last of her courage naming her enemy, without naming him. Tolliver Crane's sign creaked in the breeze, its painted letters swinging on iron hooks. Crane's Mercantile, honest goods since 1848. Reed's jaw tightened. The marshal cleared his throat, his tone casual. "She's delirious. Wounds do that. Best you don't put weight on her babbling." Reed kept his eyes on Mara, never turning. "And if it isn't babble?" The marshal didn't answer. He tapped his badge once against the doorframe like a habit, then looked away. Mrs. Kemp handed Reed a clean cloth. "Hold her steady. This has to come out." Reed crouched so his face filled her fading vision. "You hear me? Stay with me. When it's gone, you'll breathe easier." She tried to laugh, the sound thin. "Breathing hurts." "Hurts is better than gone," he said, and nodded to Mrs. Kemp. Together they eased the knife from her side. It slid free with a wet sound that made the marshal wince, but Reed's grip did not falter, his hand firm at her shoulder, his breath steady enough for her to match. The bone handle gleamed in the lamplight, its guard scratched with a mark Reed recognized now. A small flourish like a merchant's tally stroke. Mrs. Kemp rinsed it, muttering, "This isn't a drifter's blade. It's been kept clean, oiled, carried by someone who takes care with his tools." Reed's thoughts pressed heavy as lead. He wrapped the knife in cloth, slid it into his coat pocket. When he looked at Mara again, her eyes were open, glassy but fierce. She lifted trembling fingers and gripped his wrist. "Don't trust him." Her voice was air and fire mixed. Reed squeezed back, low enough only she could hear. "Then I won't." Her grip loosened, but not before a tear cut a clean line down her cheek, carving the wordless relief of being believed. Outside, footsteps scraped, slow and deliberate. Reed shifted, his hand brushing the pistol at his belt, though he kept it easy, not eager. The marshal peered through the window and muttered, "Just Crane, checking his stock." Reed's eyes never left the shadow moving across the glass. Then he can keep walking. The kettle hissed again. Mrs. Kemp bound the wound tight, her hands sure as iron. She'll live if she rests. That's all I'll promise. Reed brushed damp hair back from Mara's face. Rest. I'll hold watch. She closed her eyes, and even in her drifting he saw her lips move once more, silently forming the same warning. Reed straightened, broad shoulders filling the lamplight. His vow had already been spoken on the road, but now it hardened into something sharper. If Tolliver Crane had put this knife in her, Red Hollow would learn what a quiet man's breath could carry when it turned into fire. Night came to Red Hollow like a shutter closing, lamplight pushing against the dark, while the street outside fell into uneasy quiet. Reed sat by Mara's bedside, his chair tipped back, boots flat, hat brim low, but his eyes never closed. The wrapped knife lay heavy in his pocket, its weight a reminder that her whispers weren't fever alone. Every creak of the clinic boards, every scrape of a wagon wheel outside set his jaw tighter. Mrs. Kemp dozed in her rocker, hands folded on her apron, the lines of exhaustion deep but steady, as though she trusted Reed's silent guard more than her own strength. Mara stirred in her sleep, murmuring broken phrases. Reed leaned close enough to catch the pieces. Ledger, names, buried, don't trust him. He laid his hand gently over hers, murmuring low, Hush now. You're safe here. She calmed, her breaths evening, but the fear in her voice lodged deeper in him than the knife had lodged in her side. A sound came from the street. Boot heels, too slow for a drunkard, too deliberate for a passer-by. Reed rose, silent, and crossed to the window. He tilted the curtain just enough to see the glow of a cigar tip hovering outside Crane's Mercantile. Tolliver himself leaned against the hitch rail, puffing smoke into the dark, like a man unbothered by night or conscience. But when he turned his head, his gaze went not to his own storefront, but to the clinic window, lingering as though he knew exactly where she lay. Reed let the curtain fall. He walked back to his chair, his every step soft as if to keep the floorboards from tattling. Minutes stretched. The cigar glow moved, faded, returned again. Reed slid his hand into his pocket and traced the carved mark on the knife's guard through the cloth. He had seen the same flourish etched on the ledger pages Crane used at the store, the little tally line that marked every account. A merchant's signature, now carved into a weapon. His gut told him it wasn't coincidence. He would need proof, but for now, proof slept under his protection, fragile and breathless. Marshal Pike pushed through the clinic door without knocking, boots loud enough to wake Mrs. Kemp. She scowled but didn't rise. Evening, Pike said, eyes flicking to Mara, then to Reed. Any change? Reed's voice was low. She breathes. Good, Pike said too quickly. He leaned against the wall, thumbs hooked in his belt. Tolliver tells me you're carrying her words like gospel. I'd think twice. Man runs half this town's accounts. She's just some wanderer with a bad story and worse luck. Reed's gaze sharpened. You saying she put the knife in herself? Pike's mouth twitched. But he didn't answer. Instead, he pushed off the wall. Best let things be. Sometimes trouble follows the ones who bring it. He left as casually as he came, but Reed felt the warning wrap the room tighter than the bandage around Mara's side. When the door clicked shut, Mara's eyes opened halfway, fever bright but aware. He knows, she whispered. Reed leaned close. Knows what? She swallowed, pain etched across her face. Knows I took it. Took the ledger. Names. The girls. He'll come. Reed's heart clenched, the puzzle falling into place. The knife wasn't meant only to silence her body. It was meant to stop her from speaking what she carried. He brushed her hair back and said in a tone that steadied storms, "Then he'll find me waiting." The night thickened outside, shadows stretching, but Reed's vow burned steady. He would not let Mara slip, not while he drew breath, and not while a man like Crane thought his accounts balanced in blood. The night was long and heavy, every hour stretching like wire pulled too tight, and though Mara drifted in and out of fevered sleep, Reed's eyes never left her face, listening to each breath as if the sound itself was the measure of his promise. When dawn's first gray seeped through the clinic window, she stirred and whispered something faint, her lips shaping the word ledger. And with trembling fingers she pointed to the torn lining of her dress, where Reed discovered a folded scrap of paper darkened with blood and sweat, its edges frayed as if it had been hidden too long in fear. And when he opened it, he found not words of comfort, but a list of names, each marked with a neat flourish identical to the scratch on the knife's guard, women's names, dates, amounts, like inventory recorded as if lives were no more than crates of grain. And he realized with a cold stillness that Tolliver Crane's mercantile ledger held more than flour and salt. It held the trade of vanished brides and broken daughters. Mara's eyes filled with desperate strength as she caught his hand and pressed it to the paper, whispering hoarsely, "Proof, keep safe." And Reed nodded, folding the scrap into his own vest pocket, feeling it settle there with the knife, both evidence and burden. Then he heard boots on the boardwalk outside, a shuffle and pause, and through the thin wall came Crane's jovial voice greeting the marshal too loudly, laughter rehearsed, like a man staging a show for anyone who might doubt him. And Reed understood the danger had already circled closer than most would dare. Mrs. Kemp bustled in with broth, muttering about pests who never quit. But she met Reed's eyes long enough to tell him she too had seen shadows pacing the street, and though she said no more, he knew she would stand firm if called. Mara's lips trembled as she tried again to speak, and this time the words were clearer, though ragged. Others, still alive, in his keeping. Before a spasm seized her and Reed caught her shoulder gently, whispering, "Rest now, you've said enough." But inside him the words lit fire, because it was no longer about one woman saved from a knife. It was about every name on that stained scrap, every silence Tolliver had bought with coin or threat. Reed sat straighter, his jaw hard as stone, for he had walked into Red Hollow only to buy nails and salt. But now he carried a secret ledger of lives, a knife carved with a liar's mark, and the whispered charge of a woman who had begged to die but instead had chosen to live long enough to speak the truth, and he knew what that meant. Whatever came next, whether Crane's men rode with smiles or with guns, Reed would breathe for her, fight for her, and if need be, bleed for every stolen name scrawled in that cursed hand. The sun climbed high, spilling light across Red Hollow as if it wanted to reveal every hidden corner, but shadows clung stubbornly where Crane's mercantile stood, and Reed felt them pressing even inside the clinic walls. He had just stepped outside for a pail of fresh water when he saw a wagon halt in front of Crane's store, its bed covered with burlap, and two men, faces too clean for ranch hands, lifted down a crate heavy enough to make the boards groan. But what caught Reed's eyes wasn't the weight. It was the faint sound muffled beneath. A sob choked too fast. He stiffened, hand brushing the knife still hidden in his pocket, when Crane himself waddled out, patting the lid of the crate with the same flourish he used on ledgers, and said loud enough for bystanders, "Just another shipment from back east. Cloth, buttons, things this town can't do without." His smile wide and false. But Reed's stomach turned because he'd heard that sound before, the muffled gasp of someone trying to cry without being heard. Mrs. Kemp appeared at the door behind him, whispering, "Don't make a scene yet." But her eyes narrowed with the same suspicion. Reed watched as the crate was carried into the dim belly of the store, and he saw Crane glance once toward the clinic window where Mara lay hidden, the kind of glance a man gives when he knows his secret could unravel. Reed forced himself to walk back inside, jaw tight, but the air around him felt charged, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Inside, Mara stirred, her face pale yet fierce, and when she saw him, she rasped, "You heard it, didn't you?" He crouched by her side. "The crate?" She nodded, her hand trembling as she lifted toward his vest pocket where the scrap of names lay. "One of them. Still alive." Her voice cracked, but her eyes burned with truth. Reed sat heavy, his thoughts clashing like iron. Every instinct screamed to kick Crane's door open, but reason told him it would bring the marshal, and the marshal had already shown where his loyalty bent. Mara gripped his sleeve, whispering with all the strength she had left, "Don't trust anyone. Wait, watch." He pressed her hand gently down, promising with his eyes instead of words. Then from outside came a shout, "Fire at the stables!" and half the town thundered toward the smoke rising near the blacksmiths. Reed stepped to the window, watching chaos scatter folk away, and in that moment he saw Crane's men wheel the wagon around the back of the store, moving faster now that no eyes remained. The diversion was no accident. Reed turned to Mara, his voice low and steady. "They think distraction buys them silence." She whispered, "Then don't let them win." He tightened the band of his hat, checked the cylinder of his Colt without drawing it, and breathed deep. He had come to town as a man who wanted peace. But the knife in his pocket, the names on that paper, and the cry inside that crate had burned that peace away, and he knew before the sun set he would have to decide whether to walk into Crane's shadow alone or wait until Mara could stand and testify. Either way, the truth was no longer buried, and Red Hollow's midday air carried the weight of an oncoming storm. The fire at the stables turned out to be nothing more than hay torched in a corner stall, but it had been enough to scatter the town and leave Crane's men to move their crate unseen. And when Reed returned from the window to Mara's bedside, he found her eyes open, fever bright yet sharp, as though she had forced herself awake the moment the smoke rose. He sat, his voice low, steady as a fence post in wind. It was a diversion. They used it to hide whatever's inside that wagon. Mara's hand fluttered toward his vest pocket again, and he understood. Proof mattered more than his instincts. He drew the blood-stained scrap and unfolded it slowly, the paper crinkling like brittle bones, and together they read the list of women's names: Anna Briggs, Lydia Moore, Clara Denton, Ruth Calloway, each followed by figures and notes, the script identical to the tally scratch on the knife's guard. "Inventory," Mara whispered, a tremor in her voice. "He keeps them as numbers, not souls. Brides promised, girls traded, and when they resist—" Her breath hitched and she shut her eyes, fighting the memory. Reed folded the scrap back, tucking it firm inside his vest as if his ribs could guard it. "Then the town needs to see this," he said. She shook her head violently, coughing at the effort. "No, not yet. He owns them. Their debts, their mouths. Show it now and they'll call it forgery. Call me mad. You have to wait." Her voice cracked into pleading. "Promise me." Reed's jaw flexed, but he gave the vow, knowing it tied him more tightly than any rope. "I'll wait, but I won't let it vanish." Mara eased back against the pillow, satisfied, though weak, and he brushed her damp hair away with the gentleness of a man who did not often allow himself softness. Outside, the commotion faded, replaced by the sound of boots pacing in measured rhythm. Reed stepped to the window again and saw Marshal Pike speaking with Crane at the edge of the boardwalk, their heads close, Crane's plump hand gripping the marshal's arm too firmly for mere conversation. Pike's eyes darted toward the clinic, then away, then back again, guilt showing in the shift of his stance. Reed's chest tightened. The law was already bent. He let the curtain fall, his decision settling heavy. He could not rely on a badge to guard Mara or the truth she carried. When he returned to her side, she whispered, "If they knew I lived, they'd finish it tonight." He leaned close so his shadow covered hers. "Then tonight I'll sit where they must pass to reach you." Mrs. Kemp bustled in, carrying broth, muttering that men liked to posture, but it was women who stitched the world back together. And though her tone was sharp, her eyes softened at the sight of Reed's hand over Mara's. She knew a line had been drawn. Reed fed Mara the broth spoon by spoon, each swallow a struggle. But when she had taken enough, she sighed and whispered, "I thought I'd die nameless in the road. Instead, I found a man who refuses to let me." He did not answer aloud, but his silence was vow enough. That night, when the lamps burned low and the town's noises thinned, Reed sat in the darkened clinic with his revolver across his lap, the knife and the ledger scrap close to his heart, listening for every creak, every breath, knowing the weight of names was now his to carry, and that by morning Red Hollow would no longer be the quiet place it had pretended to be. The moon rose pale over Red Hollow, casting long fingers of silver through the warped glass of the clinic, and Reed sat in his chair like stone carved by time, his revolver across his lap, his ears sharper than sleep could ever allow. Mara dozed fitfully, her bandaged side rising and falling in shallow rhythm, each small sigh reminding him that she breathed because he had refused her wish, and outside the silence of the town grew too deliberate, the kind that hides footsteps rather than absence. Somewhere down the lane a horse snorted, then another, and the faint creak of saddle leather reached his ears. Not a drunk's stumble, not a ranch hand late from the saloon, but men who knew how to move quiet when quiet was needed. Reed rose slowly, sliding the revolver free, and crossed to the window, easing the curtain aside with 2 fingers. In the street below, 3 riders lingered by the trough, their hats pulled low, their hands restless near their belts, and though they made a show of drinking their mounts, Reed saw their eyes lift toward the clinic door again and again. He let the curtain fall. Mrs. Kemp, half dozing in her rocker, stirred when she caught the shift in his stance. "Riders," she whispered, her voice dry as paper. Reed nodded once. "Cranes?" She snorted softly. "No one else holds men on leashes this tight." She stood and patted his arm. "I'll tend her. You keep them from crossing my floor." Reed gave her a grateful glance, then stepped into the hall, boots soundless on the worn planks, and positioned himself by the door where lamplight could not betray him. The riders dismounted at last, their spurs muffled with cloth, and approached like wolves, shadows lengthening as they neared the clinic steps. One tapped the door with a knuckle, too soft for courtesy, too firm for chance. Reed's voice cut from the darkness, low and steady. "You lost." Silence answered, then a drawl feigned ignorance. "Heard there was a woman needed tending. Crane asked us to lend a hand." Reed cocked the hammer back just enough that the click was louder than words. "She's got all the hands she needs." A pause. Then another voice, harsher, said, "Best not stand between a man and what's his." Reed opened the door a crack, enough for the barrel of his Colt to gleam in moonlight. "She's not his. She's under my breath, and while I've got it, you won't touch her." The riders shifted, uneasy, one muttering about waiting until morning, another cursing under his breath, and Reed saw in their hesitation the truth. They hadn't come to test courage. They had come to silence weakness, and his presence turned the odds. After a tense moment, they retreated, mounting quickly, their hooves clattering away toward Crane's store. Reed exhaled slow, easing the hammer back, then shut the door and leaned his back against it. Inside, Mara's eyes had opened, wide and glimmering, and though her lips trembled, she whispered, "They'll keep coming." Reed crossed to her, resting a hand over hers. "Then I'll keep standing." She searched his face as if measuring whether a man's promise could really be so simple, and when she found no tremor in his gaze, her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. Reed wiped one away gently with his thumb, and in that small motion the night's danger eased for her, though the storm had only just begun. Dawn bled into Red Hollow with a hush too calm for a town that had nearly seen blood the night before, and Reed stood on the porch of the clinic, hat brim low, shoulders squared, watching the mercantile across the street where Tolliver Crane swept his steps, with an ease too deliberate, the smile pasted on his lips betraying a man who feared whispers more than bullets. Mara dozed inside, her fever cooled some by Mrs. Kemp's herbs, but before sleep claimed her she had pressed Reed's hand and whispered with fierce urgency, "Show them! They must see, before I'm gone." And those words had burned in him all night until they became resolve, so now as the town gathered for its usual morning bustle, wagons unloading, women trading eggs for flour, children chasing dogs, Reed stepped down with a folded scrap in his pocket and the wrapped knife at his side, evidence heavy as iron. He crossed the street slow, each bootfall drawing eyes, and when he halted at the mercantile steps, voices stilled, the sweep of Crane's broom faltered, and Marshal Pike emerged from the alley as if summoned by guilt. Reed lifted the stained paper high enough for all to see, his voice steady but carrying. "Whose mark is this?" The townsfolk leaned closer as he unfolded it, the inked names trembling in the morning breeze. Murmurs rippled. "Ruth Calloway, gone 2 months. Anna Briggs vanished last winter. Lydia Moore never came home." Reed turned, his gaze pinning Crane. "Every name here is a woman this town buried in silence, and every name bears your flourish." He drew the knife, its bone handle flashing in sunlight, the scratch on its guard a mirror of the ledger strokes. "Even this blade bears your hand." Crane's smile stiffened, his fat fingers tightening on the broom. "Lies," he said too quickly. "Anyone could scratch a mark." But the townsfolk had already pressed closer, faces pale as they read the names, voices rising in a mix of grief and fury. Marshal Pike tried to step between them, his badge catching the light, but his words stumbled. Let's not jump to—" "Jump?" Reed cut him sharp. "While women vanished, you told folks not to listen. While crates were carried under burlap, you called them supplies. You knew." Pike's face flushed, but he couldn't meet the eyes staring at him now. A widow near the front, her hands shaking, cried out, "My sister's name is here." Another voice shouted, "And mine." The swell of voices broke like a dam, and Crane, cornered, dropped the broom and barked, "She's lying! That wounded stray fed him poison words!" His eyes darted to the clinic window where Mara lay hidden. And Reed saw in that glance all the truth anyone needed. Reed held the knife higher. "This town can decide if it belongs to men who sell daughters and bury wives like ledger entries, or if it belongs to people who keep breath in the lungs of the broken." The silence that followed was thick, waiting, then split by the widow who screamed, "He took her from me!" and hurled a stone that cracked against Crane's steps. The crowd surged, their grief finally unmasked, and Crane stumbled backward, face white, eyes wide. Pike raised his hands helplessly, caught between badge and people. Reed stayed where he stood, voice steady above the roar. "This isn't vengeance. This is truth. Decide what you'll do with it." And in the growing storm of voices, Reed knew Mara's whisper had become more than warning. It had become the spark of a reckoning no man in Red Hollow could stop. The street had never felt so narrow, filled edge to edge with townsfolk whose voices clashed like steel. Grief and anger pouring into the dust where Crane stood cornered, his face glistening with sweat, his mouth forming excuses that no one wanted anymore. Reed kept his stance firm at the steps, the blood-stained scrap and knife visible in his hands, not waving them like weapons but holding them steady as truth itself, while Marshal Pike barked orders for calm that cracked in his throat and fell useless against the swell of voices, some shouting for Crane's arrest, others crying that justice should be taken then and there. Reed's eyes swept the crowd. He saw the blacksmith's wife clutching her apron with white knuckles, tears carving lines down her cheeks as she recognized her niece's name. He saw a ranch hand stare at the knife, his jaw working, whispering the word Lydia as though it were a prayer. He saw children pulled close by mothers who suddenly feared every shadow cast by the mercantile's walls. Crane tried one last plea, his voice high, desperate. "Ledger marks mean nothing. Names, those names are common. Anyone could write them." But Reed's calm voice cut across him like a drawn line in dust. "Then why does every mark on this knife match your hand, Tolliver? Why did your men ride to my door last night?" A murmur rippled, shifting toward certainty. Pike swore under his breath, stepped forward, and hissed at Reed low enough for only him to hear. "You're pushing this town to riot." Reed didn't flinch. "I'm pushing it to see." The marshal looked out over the crowd and read his own fate there. Men and women who would not forget which side he had chosen when silence was easier. A stone flew, striking Crane's shoulder. Another hit the mercantile wall, and he cried out, retreating up the steps, his hands fluttering as though to wipe away invisible stains. "She lies," he shouted, pointing toward the clinic window. "That woman lies to save her own sin." The words turned heads toward Mara's shadowed figure, and Reed felt fury rise cold in his chest. He raised the knife high enough that it glinted. "If she lied, why did you try to bury her in silence? Why send men to finish her in the night?" No one answered. Not even Crane, whose mouth snapped shut at the sound of his own guilt spoken aloud. For a long breath, the town seemed to tremble on the edge of violence, and then the widow with her sister's name on the list lifted her chin and shouted, "We believe her." The words struck like a hammer. Others echoed, "We believe her." Truth for the missing. And the chant spread until even Pike stepped back, his badge useless against a tide that had chosen its side. Reed lowered the knife slowly, letting the crowd's voice rise instead of his own. Crane stumbled backward into his store, slamming the door, the bolt clattering shut behind him, but it sounded more like a man sealing his own tomb. Reed turned, his face solemn, and met the eyes of the people. Justice won't be easy, but it starts with breath still living. He glanced toward the clinic, where he knew Mara fought to keep hers, and in that moment he felt the weight of every eye shift to him, not just as the man who carried proof, but as the man who would have to lead them through the storm that had broken loose in Red Hollow. The town simmered like iron in a forge, sparks flying in whispers and shouts that bled through every window and door. But inside the clinic, Reed stood still as carved granite, watching over Mara as she stirred weakly against the pillows. Her face was drawn, her lips pale, yet when her eyes opened, they carried the stubborn flame that had survived the road, the knife, and the night's terror, and she rasped, "They know now." Reed nodded once, his voice steady as a promise. "They do. Your names turned their silence into fire. Crane can't sweep it aside anymore." She breathed shallowly, wincing, then whispered, "Don't let them burn too fast. Truth needs more than fury." Her words struck him like scripture, because outside he heard the restless crowd battering against its own grief, ready to hang or burn without thought, and he knew she was right. Justice built too quick could crumble into vengeance. Mrs. Kemp appeared, her hands stained with herbs, her tone sharp, though her eyes softened on Mara. She can't be moved, but the people are hungry for her voice. If she stays silent now, rumor will eat the truth alive. Reed bent low so Mara could see his face, hear his words clear. Can you speak to them? Her lips trembled, not from fear but from the weight of carrying so many broken names in her fragile chest. If I fall trying, Reed pressed her hand firmly, then you won't fall alone. He helped her upright, his arms strong at her back, and together they moved slowly, each step costing her more than the last, until they reached the clinic porch where daylight painted the faces of half the town waiting, their voices falling into hush the moment they saw her shadow. Murmurs rippled. She's alive. She walks still. God keep her. Crane's door across the street remained bolted, but a curtain twitched, and Reed knew he watched. Mara steadied herself against the post, her voice ragged but cutting through the quiet. You think I begged for death, she said, her gaze sweeping them. But what I begged for was breath that wasn't owned. That knife was meant to bury not just me, but every woman whose name was carved like tally marks on his page. She lifted her shaking hand toward Reed, and he held out the folded scrap. Her fingers brushed it, giving the crowd proof as much as words. These names are not debts. They are lives, sisters, daughters, mothers. Do not let them vanish into Crane's pocket. A sob broke from a widow in the front, and others followed, grief spilling into the dust. Mara's knees wavered, and Reed caught her before she fell. His voice rising firm to carry her vow. You've heard her. You've seen the mark. You know what silence costs. Decide if you'll keep breathing for those who cannot. The crowd surged, not wild but resolute, voices joining in broken chorus. For the missing, for the truth. It was messy, raw, but it was real. And in their cries, Reed felt the town take its first breath, not chained by fear. Mara slumped against him, exhausted, her strength poured into the words she had fought to deliver. Reed whispered against her hair, You've done it. They'll remember now. And as the chant rose into the morning, Tolliver Crane's shutter slammed shut across the street, a sound of retreat that promised the fight wasn't over, but no longer his alone to bear. For the first time since the knife had found her side, Reed knew the tide had turned. Not toward easy justice, but toward breath that carried the broken into dawn. The voices outside the clinic did not fade with the morning sun. Instead, they swelled through Red Hollow's streets like a hymn-turned battle cry, echoing from saloon walls and barn rafters, until even those who had once whispered their doubts now stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding justice. Reed held Mara close, easing her back into her bed, her body trembling from the effort of standing before the crowd. But her eyes shone with a grim light. She had given them her truth, and the town had swallowed it whole. Mrs. Kemp fussed over her, scolding Reed for letting her walk, though in her own tired gaze was pride. Reed stepped back to the window, scanning the street. Crane's mercantile remained shuttered, though a steady trickle of his hired men slipped in through the back, as though circling for a stand. Marshal Pike lingered near the hitching post, his face pale, his badge no shield now that the people had turned. Reed watched him, weighing whether the man was coward or conspirator, when suddenly the mercantile door creaked open and Tolliver Crane waddled onto the steps, his hands raised high, a handkerchief fluttering white in one fist like a parody of surrender. "People of Red Hollow," he boomed, his voice cracking beneath the strain, I've been slandered, my good name dragged through dust, but I offer compromise. Let's not end this town in ruin. Let us keep the peace." The crowd's murmur grew restless, torn between rage and confusion. Reed stepped outside, planting himself at the edge of the clinic porch, his voice cutting across Crane's bluster. "You don't speak of peace when women's names line your ledger like stock counts." He drew the blood-stained scrap once more, raising it for all to see. "These are not rumors. These are truths, and your knife bears them as well." Crane's face blanched, yet he forced a smile. Suppose I pay reparations. Land, coin, enough to keep widows and orphans fed for years. Must we spill blood?" His words dangled like bait, and for a moment some men in the crowd shifted, tempted by the thought of silver easing grief. Mara's faint voice, carried from her window, broke through like a bell. "No coin. Buys the dead." Silence fell. Reed's chest swelled at her strength. He advanced a step, hand near his holster but voice even. "You think you can bargain with lives already stolen? You think gold replaces daughters? No. What you face is not negotiation. It's judgment." Pike tried to step forward, sweat on his brow. "Listen, folks. If we hang him without trial, the law will—" But his words were drowned by a widow who cried, "What law?" "The law let him steal her," and pointed at the ledger scrap, her grief breaking into fury. Crane stumbled back, realizing silver would not shield him. His eyes darted to his men, who shifted uneasily, half ready to draw, half ready to abandon him. Reed's hand dropped firm onto his Colt. "Think careful, boys. You draw for him, you die for him." The tension snapped taut, every breath in town held at once, the moment teetering between riot and reckoning. And in that razor silence, a child's voice pierced. "Mama's name is on that paper." Heads turned to a girl, no more than 10, clutching her aunt's skirt, eyes wet, voice breaking. The crowd's restraint shattered, not in wild rage but in united roar, and Crane's last bargain crumbled like dust beneath a storm. Reed's eyes never left him, knowing the final act of justice had been set in motion, and nothing Crane offered now could buy it back. The roar of the crowd rolled down Red Hollow's main street like thunder breaking free of the mountains, a sound too fierce to be silenced by badges or bribes, and Tolliver Crane stumbled back against his mercantile door, as though he could press himself into its wood and vanish. But there was no vanishing left. Reed stepped forward from the clinic porch, his boots sinking into dust made holy by grief. The scrap of names in one hand, the knife in the other, each piece heavy not as weapons but as truth. Too long buried, and the crowd parted to let him pass, their eyes fixed not on his gun but on his certainty. Pike stood frozen, badge catching sunlight that mocked its emptiness, his lips moving with excuses he never voiced, and Reed did not slow as he brushed past, his voice deep and steady. "The time for bargains is gone." Crane's chest heaved, his face slick, his eyes darting to the crowd for one ally and finding none, then landing on Reed as if clinging to the last post in a flood. "You think you're righteous? You think you can judge me?" His voice cracked high, desperate. Reed stopped at the bottom step, the crowd behind him silent as stones, and lifted the scrap of names. "I don't judge you. They do. Every woman you marked, every family you robbed, every silence you bought. They're your judges now." He let the paper flutter into the dust where the people could see, could touch, and the names seemed to burn hotter than fire itself. A widow knelt, her fingers trembling as they brushed her sister's name, and she began to sob. Another man bent low, muttering the name of a niece vanished months ago. Their grief braided into fury, and when they rose, their eyes no longer sought Reed but fixed on Crane. "What do you want from me?" Crane cried, voice breaking as stones thudded against the mercantile wall around him. "Mercy?" Reed's voice was quiet but carried through the hush. "We want truth. Say their names, Tolliver. Say every one of them." For a moment it seemed he might resist, but his lips trembled, and like a dam cracked by flood he began to speak, voice shuddering through each syllable. Anna Briggs, Lydia Moore, Clara Denton, Ruth Calloway. The crowd echoed them back, voices rising into a chant, as though the women themselves had returned to stand in judgment. By the time the last name left his mouth, Crane collapsed to his knees, shaking. Reed turned, sweeping the crowd with his gaze. "You've heard him confess. Decide now what justice means in Red Hollow." The silence hung, then broke as one voice shouted, "He'll not sell another daughter." Another cried, "Not bury another wife." And the chant became demand. "No more! No more!" Reed stepped back, letting the tide move, knowing his part was done. He had carried truth to the door, but justice was theirs to deliver. Crane was seized, his pleas drowned by the voices of those he had wronged. And Reed turned away, his steps slow, heavy, but certain. At the clinic door, Mara waited, pale yet standing, her eyes wide with tears as she whispered, "You kept breath in me, and now you've given it back to them." Reed reached her, taking her hand gently, steadying her against the frame. "No, Mara, you gave it back. I only refuse to let it die." The chant still echoed behind them, fierce and raw, but in her tired smile, Reed saw the first light of something more than vengeance, something like hope. And in that moment he knew Red Hollow would never again be the quiet town it once pretended to be. It would be the place where silence broke and breath endured. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been standing in Red Hollow, would you have demanded Crane's punishment or begged for mercy? Tell us in the comments.